This is Orbiting Jupiter by Gary Schmidt, Chapter 4. This is what he told us. Madeline Joyce was 13 years old when she met Joseph Brooke. She lived in a house that had pillars in the front and a wing on each side and statues on the lawn. Her father and her mother were both lawyers, so she spent a lot of time by herself in that big house when she wasn't away at her prep school. Sometimes she had a nanny who lived in the North Guest House, sometimes not. The nanny was there the hot summer morning the plumber came to change the shower heads and faucets in the upstairs bathrooms, all 5 of the upstairs bathrooms. He brought his son to carry the tools. His son's name was Joseph. He was 13 years old, too. 2 days later, Joseph knocked on Madeline's door. He had walked 7 miles to get there. They spent the day together. They watched a few movies. She showed him how to play tennis on a clay court. They walked through paths cut into the back acreage. And just before he left, he jumped into the pool with all his clothes on. It would keep him cool on the way home, he said. She laughed. That summer, Joseph came every day, except the weekends, when Madeline's parents were home. They watched movies, they played tennis on clay courts, they walked long walks through the back acreage, and they swam in the pool. She laughed, and sometimes he laughed too. She never asked him why his face looked so beat up. He didn't tell her what his father was doing to him because he wasn't around anymore to carry the tools. That fall, she went away to school in Andover. It nearly killed Joseph. He went to the library computers every afternoon to write her. Writing stunk, but it was better than nothing. A little better than nothing. She came back home for Thanksgiving, and Joseph walked 7 miles to see her on the stormy, icy Friday afterward. The nanny answered the door. "Aren't you the plumber's boy?" she said. Joseph said he was. Was Madeline home? The nanny looked at him. "Go away before you get yourself into a lot of trouble you don't want." She closed the door. Joseph walked home. 7 miles. On Sunday, Madeline went back to her school in Andover. She came home again for Christmas break. On the first Monday, Joseph walked 7 miles. It was cold and snowy, and Joseph's coat was too small, but he walked 7 miles and knocked at her door. This time, Madeline answered, and she held out her hands. She brought him inside. She had hot chocolate, and he had coffee in the kitchen. They sat by the fire and talked and talked and talked. They went outside. Joseph used the gardener's old coat, and they walked through the quiet, snowy acreage, holding hands. Madeline threw snowballs at him and hit him sometimes. He threw snowballs too, but he never hit her, not once. He couldn't even imagine hitting Madeline with a snowball because he loved her. He loved her. He had never known love before. He had never known how much it could fill him. He had never known anything, he thought. Behind the acreage, they walked along a frozen river, and Madeline pretended she was skating. She was beautiful beyond beautiful, even skating in her boots. The sun went down, and she skated in her boots, and skated, and Joseph watched her until the sky was dark, and Joseph was up, and Joseph pointed to it. "That's my favorite planet," he said. And she held his arm and looked at Jupiter, and she said, "Mine too now." When they got back from the snowy woods, the nanny's car was in the driveway. Madeline told him to keep the coat, and Joseph walked home. 7 miles. Madeline's Christmas break lasted for 3 weeks. Joseph came every day, except for the weekends. On the weekends, he stayed home and thought about Madeline until everything in him almost burst. He had never known. How could he have known? On the day before Madeline had to go back to Andover, Joseph walked 7 miles to her house in a rain that was mostly sleet, and the gardener's jacket did just about nothing to keep him warm. He was soaked and shivering when Madeline opened the door. She brought him over to the fire and found him a red woolen blanket. And what was he thinking? He could die in weather like this. And he got out of his wet things and wrapped himself in the red woolen blanket and sat close to the fire while she made hot chocolate and coffee. She brought the mugs in, and they sat together, and Madeline asked Joseph what he remembered about his mother, and he said he remembered going outside with her after a storm and pouring boiling maple syrup onto new snow and then eating it. That afternoon, while Joseph's things were drying, they boiled maple syrup, and Joseph put on the gardener's boots, and they took the pan outside. They found new snow, and they ladled the syrup into the powder, and when it froze, sort of, Joseph picked it up and fed it to Madeline. And Madeline picked it up and fed it to Joseph, and she smeared some on his mouth, and she laughed and leaned forward, and she kissed him for the first time. The first time. Then they went back inside, under the red woolen blanket. The nanny found them later, and the trouble she had predicted began. She said she wasn't going to be held responsible and she wasn't going to lose her job over this. No, sir, she wasn't. But she did. Madeline's parents took out an injunction against Joseph. A policeman delivered it. Joseph was to have no contact at all with Madeline. Any violation meant he would be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, the very fullest extent. Then the state of Maine Department of Health and Human Services delivered their news. Joseph and his father would begin receiving monthly visits and evaluations. And Madeline was withdrawn from her school in Andover and sent to a school in western Pennsylvania. Joseph did not know which one. 3 months later, the Department of Health and Human Services visited Joseph's father while Joseph was at school. Mrs. Stroud told him that Madeline Joyce was pregnant. She was still only 13 years old. Based upon this new information and Mrs. Stroud's observation, the DHHS had decided to remove Joseph from his home and to place him in a juvenile facility for boys. Mr. Brooke should know that his son might face criminal charges. Wouldn't be the first time, said Joseph's father to Mrs. Stroud, and probably not the last. Mrs. Stroud was waiting for Joseph when he came home from school. His father said, "Hey, stud, you got some girl." "Joseph," Mrs. Stroud said, "I want to talk with you about Madeline." Afterward, he packed. He was sort of numb. He was going to be a father. A father. He was 13. A father. Oh, he was going to be a father. And he knew he had to be with Madeline, and they were going to have a baby, and he had to keep the baby away from his father, and that meant they would have to leave Maine. Maybe Madeline's parents would help them. And that's what he asked Mrs. Stroud as they drove away. Could he see Madeline now? Would her parents help him? For a long time, Mrs. Stroud didn't say a thing. Finally, she told him the truth. Madeline's parents were not going to help them, and he could not see Madeline. She was in school in western Pennsylvania for 2 more months, and then she would return to New England. It was not Joseph's business where she would stay. He should forget her. He was only 13. He was going to be a father, he said. He was only 13, she said again. She took him to a group home for boys. He stayed 1 day and 1 night and left. Mrs. Joyce called the police when he showed up at their house. The police did not care when Joseph told them he only wanted to talk to Madeline's parents. He only wanted them to know who he was, who he really was, so they would let him see Madeline. He wanted them to know. He wanted them to know he loved her. After that, if they didn't want to help them with the baby, then okay. He wanted them to know they'd make it on their own. He would work. He would do whatever it took. He loved her. "How old are you, kid?" asked the policeman. Joseph told them. "You're just a baby yourself," said the policeman. The policeman took him back to the group home. Joseph stayed 1 day and 1 night, and then he left. The police found him on the Pennsylvania Turnpike, thumbing west. They took him to Lake Adams Juvenile, with a fence around it, a very high fence. The exits were always locked. During the night, the door to his room was locked, from the outside. In October, Mrs. Stroud came with papers. "What are they for?" said Joseph. "You're a minor," said Mrs. Stroud, "and your father is still your legal guardian. But we think it's important that you, as the father, sign these papers. They involve parental rights, Joseph, which you are signing over to the state so that we can find the best possible future for your baby. And frankly, since your father is not cooperating, we need you to help us." That was how Joseph learned, for the first time, he was now a father. He looked at the forms. The baby was a girl. Her name was Jupiter Joyce. Joseph wept. Mrs. Stroud handed him a photograph. "I'm really not supposed to give you this, but the baby was beautiful, beautiful beyond beautiful. She was holding her perfect hands and her perfect fingers and her perfect fingernails up over her head, and her tiny mouth was wide with a yawn, and her eyes were open, and she was looking at him, right at him. And she was warm in a light green blanket and a light green cap, and she glowed with light like the brightest planet in the darkest sky. "Joseph," said Mrs. Stroud, "you need to sign these papers." "No," he said. "Joseph, Jupiter has to be put up for adoption. I promise you, she'll go to a good family who will love her and take care of her." "I love her. I'll take care of her." He put the picture in his pocket. "Joseph, you're barely 14. You can't take care of her. If you want what's best for Jupiter, you'll..." We're what's best for Jupiter, said Joseph. Maddie and me. Mrs. Stroud put her hand against Joseph's face. He did not move. Joseph, I didn't want to tell you this. I thought it would be too much. Maybe it will be too much. But you have to sign these papers. If you don't, Madeline's parents will prosecute you. Joseph looked at her. There were complications. Joseph, Madeline. Don't say anything, Joseph said quickly. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't say anything. Don't. Joseph, please. That was how Joseph heard, for the first time, that he would never see Madeline again, never touch her again, never talk to her again, never walk through the woods with her again. That was how Joseph heard, for the first time, that Madeline, whom he loved, was gone. Madeline would want this, said Mrs. Stroud. Quickly he signed the papers and ran back toward his room. He stopped in the boys' bathroom. He didn't know what was coming over him, but it was huge and terrible and strong. It was inside him and outside him, and it was already starting to scream, and it was getting louder, and his head was getting louder, and his brain was getting louder, and he threw water in his face, but he couldn't stop it. 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 When Manny Toole came in, he said Joseph looked like he needed something bad, and he could have these if he wanted them, and he held out his hand, and there were 2 yellow pills. Joseph took them both and splashed water into his mouth, and the whole world exploded, and he staggered into one of the stalls and shattered there until one of the teachers found him. Later, his hands bound behind him, they told Joseph he tried to kill the teacher. That's when Joseph went to Stone Mountain. He stayed 1 day and 1 night, and then he tried to leave. At the top of the fence, his foot caught in a roll of razor wire. When he pulled it free, the razor ripped over the top of his foot, and as he fell, the razor sliced open his side, starting from under his right arm and cutting all along to almost his knee. The doctor said he never put so many stitches into one boy's body before. When Mrs. Stroud came to see him, she said Madeline was gone. So where did he think he was going? Joseph didn't say anything. Mrs. Stroud said she couldn't help him if he wouldn't talk to her. So Joseph looked at her and said, Where do you think I was going? Joseph, said Mrs. Stroud, you can't be a father when you're only 14. I am a father, said Joseph. No, said Mrs. Stroud. You signed away, I'm Jupiter's father, said Joseph. I will always be Jupiter's father. After that, he wouldn't talk with Mrs. Stroud. He wouldn't talk with anyone. He lived at Stone Mountain for a month. He wouldn't talk to anyone, not even when he got beat up. Not the first time, not the second time, not the third time. Not even when they held him down, and he wouldn't talk to anyone. After the third time, Mrs. Stroud said she was going to speak with the best foster parents she knew. She couldn't promise anything. They hadn't taken in any boys for almost 12 years. They lived on an organic farm. Would he like that? Living on a farm? They didn't have much technology, but they had a pond and acres of land and animals. What did he think? A week later, Joseph came to Eastham. He began to milk cows. That night, after skating on the pond under the silver moon and Jupiter, Joseph talked more than he had ever talked before altogether. It was like he had finally figured out who he wanted to tell, and once he started, he couldn't stop until he was done. It took a long time. My father and mother and I didn't say anything. We hardly moved, except my father, who had to add all the wood I had brought out to the fire. And when Joseph finished, he went up to the big barn, and we could hear Rosie mooing. I think he didn't want us to see him, But it was okay if Rosie saw. It was okay for Rosie to tell Joseph that she loved him. My father kicked out the fire. My mother held me. I said, Why can't he see Jupiter? And they said I had to try to understand. Joseph was only 14. He couldn't be a father. Seeing Jupiter would only hurt him even more. And Jupiter might be upset, maybe even frightened. Suppose you're wrong, I said. Suppose Jupiter wants to find Joseph. My mother held me even closer. My father put his hand on my back. All right, and before we continue too much further, I want to pause for a second and take you back a page to page 84. If you can see that section here, after the third time Mrs. Stroud said she was going to speak with the best foster parents she knew. She couldn't promise anything. They hadn't taken in any boys for almost 12 years. And I just want to remind you that Jack is almost just about 12 years So I want to make sure sometimes students, when we're reading this book together, sometimes they'll miss that little clue about Jack's background. So I wanted to make sure you caught it. All right, moving on. Joseph came in late that night. He got ready for bed, then stood by the window, even though the room was really cold. He looked out the panes that were already a little frosted over, and the moonlight flooded him, and his scar was a bright, ragged line along his side. He leaned into the glass until his forehead touched the pane. He stood there perfectly still, the moonlight flooding him as if it would drown him, but he didn't move. "Joseph," I finally said, "it's freezing." He didn't turn around. "What are you looking at?" "I can't see Jupiter," he said. "The moon's too bright, and I don't know where she is." "It's where it always is," I said. "No, it isn't." He wrapped his arms around himself. When he finally turned, I could see his breath in the moonlight. "I'm going to find her," he said. "I'm not going to stay alone." "You're not alone." He shook his head. "You're not." "I'm alone," he said. "You got me," I said. He laughed, but not a happy laugh. "Jackie, I'm a whole lifetime ahead of you," he said. He left the window and climbed up onto the bunk. The moonlight kept flooding into the dark. "It's Jack," I said. "Yeah," he said. "And no, you're not," I said. He settled into the bed. "Okay," he said. I woke up again and again that night, but I didn't hear Joseph moving or breathing or dreaming. If it hadn't been for the dent his body made above me, I would have thought that he was gone. Downstairs, the chimney clock chimed the quarter hours, and I heard a lot of them, until once I woke and the dent was gone, and I jerked up and looked across the room. Joseph was standing by the window again. The moon was down. He was looking for Jupiter in the cold and the dark. By morning, it was snowing. Not a lot, but enough to pile up on the branches and the cupola on the barn and the woodpile. And if we wanted to skate again, we'd have to shovel off the ice on the pond again. The bus was a little late, and Mr. Haskell skidded the back tires in the new snow when he stopped for us. I guess Mr. Haskell didn't like the way Joseph looked at him when he got on. "Hey, you think you could drive a bus better? Go ahead." He leaned back and pointed to the steering wheel. "Go ahead." Joseph walked past him on the way to the back. "That's what I thought," said Mr. Haskell, and he levered the door closed and gunned the engine so the bus swayed sharply. Joseph walked down the aisle like he was walking on a sidewalk. I fell into Danny Nations. "You want to try finding your own seat?" he said. I slid behind him, next to Ernie Humphrey, who was looking out the window like it was the most important thing in the whole wide world. "It's snow, Ernie," I said. "White flakes? They come down every winter. You've seen them before." We passed Old First Congregational, Mr. Haskell skidding the back tires around for the left turn so that the Alliance Bridge came into view and then whirled out of view like a movie camera going berserk. We all held on. Ernie turned to me, and his face was tight. "Listen, Jack." "Relax, Ernie. He's not going into the river. You won't die. Just listen. Don't hang around with Psycho back there, okay?" "What's that supposed to mean?" "Just don't hang around with him." "Why?" "No reason." "Ernie." "I said no reason." Danny Nations leaned over his seat, twisting one of his earbuds. "What's so serious back here?" "Nothing," said Ernie. "I think someone's tighty-whitey's got a little too tighty," said Danny. "Shut up," Ernie said, and went back to looking out the window.